We're discussing the mitzvah described in the Talmud of reading the Shema at bedtime, regardless of whether one has fulfilled their technical daily obligation of reading the Shema every day. The Shema should be read morning and evening, but here the Talmud is discussing another approach or another circumstance in which a person might read the Shema. And this is when going to bed. And as we discussed, that this is an entirely different context. It's in the context of a person going to bed, and naturally, the time that a person lies down to sleep is a time when they are less intentional and prone to disturbing thoughts, negative thoughts, and impure thoughts. And we might look at this following teaching to really examine in general our approach to our subconscious urges and how we confront our reflexive negative tendencies. I think the premise here is, we think that we think, therefore we are. In reality, we don't think much about what we do. And therefore, the lying down to bed, the mita, is, in a sense, the symbol for that dynamic of the human condition where we don't think about what we're doing, we act reflexively and instinctively, and sometimes this brings up negative tendencies. And so, that's why we mentioned, as the Gemara says, the bottom of Daf Dalet Amud Beis, Barachos, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Afal b'shikara Ram Kriyash Mabveis HaKnesses, Mitzvah Lekros Al Mitoso. Even though a person has already fulfilled their obligation of reading the Shema, it's a mitzvah to do so at bedtime or as one falls asleep. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Ma'ikra, Rigzu Val Techto, Imru Bilvavchem Al Mishkabchem V'Dom Musela. Tremble, do not sin. Say in your hearts, as you lie down and be silent, that this is the idea of bringing about a fear of God as we, in order to counteract those negative tendencies. Yeah? So you're asking, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that a person should read the Shema at bedtime. And the question is, how much of the Shema should one read? The truth is there are different customs. Some have the custom to read all 3 paragraphs of the Shema. And the next line of the Talmud, if a person is a Torah scholar, they don't need to read the Shema, I think reflects that idea. And in our practice of the nighttime meditations, we recite many different verses. And that, I think, is encompassing the general idea that if you're saying verses of Torah, that accomplishes the same idea. Abaye says, nonetheless, even if you do say the Shema, you should incorporate some prayerful verses in order to bring to mind the spiritual and prayerful element of reading the Shema, that it shouldn't just be a cerebral exercise as we discussed yesterday. Kagon, for example, Biyadcha kiruchi potisosi Hashem ke'el emes, into your hand I entrust my spirit, you have redeemed me, God, Lord of truth. Omra Levi Bar Chama, the Gemara continues, Omre Shlakish, La'olam yargiz adam yetzer tov al yetzer hara. And it's this continuation that gives me this context of the teaching, which is that it's an approach to dealing with the Yetzer Hara, with the negative instinct and inclination. A person should always anger their good inclination against their evil inclination. And what Rabbi Levi Bar Chama is suggesting here, perhaps, is that we often enter into a dialogue and a debate with our Yetzer Hara, with our negative instinct or negative inclination. And we argue, is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? and we try to have an inner debate about what's the right thing to do. Says Rab Levi Bar Chama, that's not the right approach. Because while it presents itself with reasoning, the underlying thing here is not an intentional thought, it's a desire. And therefore the response to that should be with forceful emotional language, to sort of overpower this knee-jerk reaction that masquerades as with all kinds of rationalizations. Shenemar rigzu v'al, and he quotes the same verse that we said earlier, tremble and do not sin, which was used to refer to the Shema, to the nighttime Shema. Which is to say, when we want to confront these tendencies, the way to do it is not with intellectual debate, it's with spiritual forcefulness. Im nitzcho mutav. If that works, fine. V'im lav yasok b'Torah. And if that doesn't work, a person should engage in Torah study. And again, here the idea of Torah study is not for the purpose of the intellectual argument. It's bringing on the spiritual energy of being in a positive place, of being in a constructive place that automatically removes the negative inclinations. Im nitzcho, if that works, if that overpowers the evil, good. Im lav yikra kriya shema. If not, a person should read the Shema. Shenemar al mishkavchem. Im nitzcho, if that conquers the evil inclination, mutav, that's good. Im lav yaskir lo yom hamisa, he should remind himself of his day of death. Shenemar v'do musela, and be silent. Indeed, Omer Rav Yitzchak kol hakore kriya shema mitaso ki lo ochi cherev shel shtei fios biyado. Rav Yitzchak says, whoever reads the nighttime Shema as they go to sleep, it is as though they hold a double-edged sword. Shenemar romos kel bigronom v'cherev pifios biyadam. The praise of God is in their throat, and a double-edged sword in their hand. My mashma. What does this mean? Omer Mar Zutra v'yitem Rabashi. It's to tell us that kol hakore kriya shema mitaso. I'm sorry, it's to tell us, Mereshe Dekra, Dechsiv Yalzu Chasidim Bechavad Yuran Ramish Kevosam, those, how do we know that this idea of reading the Shema is related to the double-edged sword? It just says those who praise God hold a double-edged sword. He says you have to look to the previous verse that says, Yalzu Chasidim Bechavad Yuran Ramish Kevosam, the pious rejoice in glory, they sing on their beds. And that is the idea that if we read the Shema in our beds, we hold that double-edged sword. What's the idea of the double-edged sword? It is killing from the removing the negativity is one blade, and the second blade is overwhelming with positivity. And so in this sense, the reading of the Shema is a catch-all for this notion that on the one hand, while we're doing something positive, we are necessarily physically not doing something negative. And at the same time, by the spiritual and holy nature of what we're doing, it inspires us and gives us courage and strength. Rav Kook points out a fascinating thing. He says, if we look at the three stages, the three previously mentioned steps that a person should do in their battle against the evil inclination, he says, first a person should be forceful and energetic, yargiz. If that doesn't work, they should read the Shema. They should study Torah, rather. If that doesn't work, they should read the Shema. And if that doesn't work, they should remember their day of death. So he says, ideally, a person should be able to engage themselves with spiritual strength, with spiritual forcefulness. Roshei Hamatos. However, not always is one feeling spiritually strong. What's the answer to that? What's the antidote to that? The study of Torah. By inspiring and thinking about higher things, filling one's intellect with light, that will give us the spiritual energy. He says not everyone is so intellectually endowed, and not everyone is able to read Torah and feel inspired. And so if that's the case, we read the Shema, which is a visceral and emotional relationship with God. You should love God, you should fear God. And this kind of is another approach. Perhaps we might say, if a person doesn't understand the Devar Torah, let them sing a niggin. Let them bring some joy, some love into their life, love of God. And if that doesn't work, sometimes a person is so negative, sometimes a person is so caught up with their stuff, they're overwhelmed by their physicality. They're just so stuck in their human experience, in their day-to-day drudgery, that they can't see past their paycheck, they can't see past their food, they can't see past just all the stuff that they're stuck with. So he says, if that's the case, you have to break down the physical experience, and you have to remember that this life doesn't go on forever. And the day of death is a tangible experience, is a tangible way of remembering what's important in life. And certainly we see this when we experience death. When we see death, we remember what life is all about. And it's healthy from time to time to remember that we are going to die. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Now, with regards to the mentioning the day of death, it seems like a morose and depressing thing to think about. So one Gadol mentioned, is when you read this Gemara, you might remember the life insurance agent. The life insurance agent seems to be Masker Yom HaMisa. He seems to be saying, you're going to die. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And this is something, you should buy this insurance policy in order to be able to take care of your loved ones, because death is an inevitability. But at the same time, inherent in the business model of selling life insurance is the hope that a person will live a long life. Because if people die quickly, the life insurance company will collapse. And so the person who's telling you life insurance, and he's saying, remember you're going to die, is also implicitly saying, but I hope that you're going to live a long life. And in a sense, this engagement of selling life insurance is based on the hope for long life. And the same is true when we say, Yasker Yom HaMisa, remember the day of death. It's not to be depressed and to be morose. It is in order to live a better life. We're Masker Yom HaMisa, we remember the day of death, so that the next day and the day that I'm living right now will be more full, will be more worthy, will be really more alive. And the correct time to do this, as our sages are telling us, is it's not practical, of course, to think about this all day. Even though he says la'olam yargiz, it means consistently. And so each day, at the end of the day, a person should take a moment to think about where their life is going, and to contemplate what they can improve and what they can remove from their life. Negativity. If we spend all day thinking about how we can improve our life, we get nothing done. And so the best thing to do during the day is to think about doing what we're doing, thinking about life. But from time to time, a person has to, al mitaso, at the end of the day, consider how they can improve their life. Yeah? Why do we have the other level? So you're pointing out that the most hard hitting seems to be Yasker Yom HaMisa, to remember the day of death. I think it seems to me, and so why don't we just go straight to that, and we go in this step-by-step process of Yargiz Yilmod Torah Yikra Kriya Shema. It seems to me that it's all about the Cherev Shel Shtei Piyos, that the study of Torah and the reading of the Shema have the quality of containing within them the act is inherently an act of sanctity. And by reading the Shema, one is in that moment using the Cherev Shel Shtei Piyos, one is using the double-edged sword. Whereas the Yom, remembering the day of death, is kind of allowing one to go back. It's stripping away the nonsense that will allow a person to go back and to read the Shema and to study Torah and look at it with the proper intention so that they can remove negativity from their life. Meaning, the thing with the remembering of the day of death is that it only removes negativity. It doesn't insert positivity in your life. And so we need to, ideally, we should be doing something that removes negativity and inserts positivity at the same time. You can't do that? Okay, sometimes you have to cut out a tumor in order to be able to grow back healthy. That's all. So why don't you start with the stronger medicine? In medicine, the reason we don't start with the stronger medicine is because a stronger medicine usually has stronger side effects. But if a medicine is really purely good, then you go to the strongest thing. Why not? If there's no downside, then why not go to the heaviest one? If it's not expensive and it's not dangerous, do it. Norva then. So I think that Taka in this case, the Yaskelo Yom HaMisa, the remembering day of death, does have side effects. First of all, it can make a person depressed, as we said. So I gave a whole hasbara, whole explanation why it shouldn't be depressing. But the reality is that in our experience, it can have a negative side effect. So it's much better to do something positive, right? It's much better to study Torah. Studying Torah, it seems to be, is the strongest medicine. Reading the Shema is a less strong medicine. And the Yom HaMisa is the least strong medicine in their inherent effectiveness, but in dealing with the negativity in our life, so they have like an inverse, I think they have an inverse effectiveness. Torah has the maximum positivity, but if a person is not open, if a person is not a spiritual seeker, then they're not going to receive the most powerful light of Torah. Right? So, on the other hand, the Yom HaMisa is the least on the positive side, but is the strongest in removing a person, in making a person to be open for a spiritual seeker. You hear? Yeah, I'm asking. So those of us who are experiencing death, we have to recognize that that's a moment to really recognize the openness, the spiritual openness that gives us, but then to really look for something to fill it with, Torah, Shema, filling our lives with inspiring teachings and meditating on the presence of Hashem in our lives.